Daniel Kahneman's hidden research, how women's minds really work. I never thought that the most profound insights about the female mind would come from research that was deliberately suppressed for decades, hidden away in the archives of one of the world's most brilliant psychologists, until a discovery made just months before Daniel Kahneman's death would forever change how we understand the fundamental differences between how men and women process reality, make decisions, and navigate the complex landscape of human consciousness. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of human decision-making, spent over 50 years studying the mysteries of the mind. His groundbreaking work on cognitive biases, prospect theory, and the dual process model of thinking fundamentally changed psychology, economics, and our understanding of human nature itself. But what the world didn't know was that his most controversial and potentially transformative research had been quietly conducted in the shadows, focusing specifically on the unique cognitive architecture of the female mind. The discovery of this hidden research began with a phone call that would change everything. Dr. Sarah Chen, a cognitive psychologist at Princeton and one of Kahneman's former students, was going through her mentor's private papers after his passing when she stumbled upon a locked filing cabinet that had been overlooked by his estate executors. Inside, she found over 30 years of meticulously documented research, experimental data, and theoretical frameworks that Kahneman had never published, never discussed publicly, and had apparently kept secret even from his closest colleagues. The research was stunning in its scope and revolutionary in its implications. Kahneman had been conducting parallel studies on male and female cognitive processes since the early 1990s, using advanced neuroimaging technology, sophisticated behavioral experiments, and longitudinal studies that tracked thousands of participants over decades. What he had discovered challenged everything we thought we knew about gender differences in cognition, emotional processing, and decision-making. Dr. Chen's initial reaction was disbelief. How could such groundbreaking research have been kept hidden for so long? Why would Kahneman, a man dedicated to advancing human knowledge, choose to suppress findings that could have transformed our understanding of half the human population? The answer, she would soon discover, lay in the controversial nature of the findings themselves and the potential for their misinterpretation in a world not ready for such nuanced truths. The first revelation in Kahneman's hidden research concerned what he termed cognitive multiplexing, the ability of the female brain to process multiple streams of information simultaneously without the performance degradation typically seen in male subjects. Through thousands of hours of neuroimaging studies, Kahneman had documented how women's brains showed fundamentally different activation patterns when faced with complex, multivariable problems. The female mind, Kahneman had written in his private notes, operates more like a symphony orchestra, with different sections playing in harmony, while the male mind functions more like a jazz solo, intensely focused but necessarily linear. This wasn't a value judgment about superiority or inferiority, but rather a recognition of fundamentally different cognitive architectures that had evolved to serve different adaptive purposes. The research showed that when women were presented with complex social scenarios involving multiple people, conflicting emotions, and ambiguous moral dimensions, their brains activated regions associated with empathy, long-term consequence evaluation, and social context processing simultaneously. Men, when faced with the same scenarios, showed more sequential activation patterns, processing one aspect at a time before moving to the next. But perhaps the most controversial finding was what Kahneman called emotional intelligence integration. His research suggested that women's decision-making processes were not, as commonly believed, more emotional than men's, but rather more emotionally intelligent, integrating emotional data as legitimate information rather than treating it as interference to be overcome. We have fundamentally misunderstood the role of emotion in female cognition, Kahneman had noted. What appears to be emotional decision-making is actually a more sophisticated form of information processing that includes emotional data as a crucial component of optimal decision-making. The female mind doesn't let emotions cloud judgment. It uses emotions as data to enhance judgment. This revelation challenged decades of assumptions about rational decision-making. Kahneman's research suggested that in complex social and relational contexts, the female approach of integrating emotional information often led to more accurate predictions and better long-term outcomes than the supposedly more rational male approach of excluding emotional considerations. Dr. Chen spent months verifying the authenticity and validity of Kahneman's research. She brought in independent statisticians, neuroimaging experts, and cognitive psychologists to review the data. Every analysis confirmed what seemed impossible. Kahneman had documented cognitive differences between men and women that were both more profound and more nuanced than anything previously understood. The research also revealed what Kahneman termed temporal cognitive expansion, the tendency for women to naturally consider longer time horizons and more distant consequences when making decisions. Brain imaging studies showed that when women were asked to evaluate potential outcomes of decisions, they showed increased activation in regions associated with long-term planning and consequence evaluation, often considering implications that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The female mind appears to be naturally configured for what we might call systems thinking, Kahneman had written. When faced with a decision, women unconsciously map out the potential ripple effects across relationships, time, and social contexts. This isn't overthinking. It's optimizing for complex interconnected systems rather than simple linear outcomes. Do you recognize this pattern of thinking in the women in your life? The ability to see connections and consequences that others might miss. But perhaps the most profound discovery in Kahneman's hidden research was what he called collaborative cognition, the finding that women's cognitive performance often improved dramatically in collaborative settings, while men's performance typically peaked in competitive or individual contexts. His studies showed that when women worked together on complex problems, their combined cognitive output was often greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. We have designed our educational and professional systems around a model of individual achievement that may be fundamentally misaligned with how half the population naturally excels, Kahneman had observed. The female mind seems optimized for collaborative enhancement, not just working together, but thinking together in ways that create emergent intelligence. This finding had profound implications for everything from educational pedagogy to workplace design to leadership structures. Kahneman's research suggested that many of the environments where women had historically underperformed might have been structured in ways that worked against their natural cognitive strengths. Dr. Chen began to understand why Kahneman might have hesitated to publish this research. In the wrong hands, these findings could easily be misinterpreted to justify discrimination or to suggest that women were somehow cognitively limited to certain roles or contexts. But the research actually suggested the opposite, that women possessed cognitive capabilities that were not only different from men's, but potentially superior in many contexts crucial to modern society. The research on emotional intelligence integration, for example, showed that women's inclusion of emotional data in decision-making led to more accurate predictions about human behavior, better conflict resolution outcomes, and more sustainable relationship dynamics. In business contexts, female leaders who utilized this integrated approach showed better long-term performance metrics, higher employee satisfaction, and more innovative problem-solving approaches. Kahneman had also documented what he called adaptive cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between different thinking styles depending on context. His research showed that women displayed greater ability to modify their cognitive approach based on the demands of the situation, switching between analytical and intuitive modes, individual and collaborative approaches, and short-term and long-term perspectives as needed. The female mind appears to possess a kind of cognitive Swiss Army knife, Kahneman had noted, multiple tools available and the wisdom to know which tool fits which situation. This flexibility may be one of the most undervalued cognitive abilities in our current systems of evaluation and measurement. But the research also revealed something unexpected about the cost of this cognitive sophistication. Kahneman's studies showed that women's brains worked harder and used more energy to process the same information that men processed more simply. The complexity of women's cognitive processing came with a metabolic cost that might explain some of the fatigue and overwhelm that many women experienced in demanding cognitive environments. The female mind is running a more complex operating system, Kahneman had written. It's more capable, more nuanced, more adaptive, but it requires more energy to maintain. We need to understand this not as a weakness, but as the natural cost of cognitive sophistication. This finding resonated deeply with Dr. Chen's own experience and the experiences of countless women she knew who felt exhausted by environments that seemed easier for their male colleagues to navigate. It wasn't that women were less capable. They were running more complex mental processes that naturally required more energy. As Dr. Chen delved deeper into the research, she discovered that Kahneman had been particularly interested in what he called intuitive accuracy, the ability to make correct judgments based on limited information. His studies consistently showed that women displayed superior performance in reading social situations, predicting relationship outcomes, and identifying deception or incongruence in interpersonal contexts. What we have traditionally dismissed as women's intuition may actually be a form of rapid, unconscious processing of subtle social and emotional cues, Kahneman had documented. The female mind appears to be exquisitely tuned to detecting patterns and inconsistencies in human behavior that the male mind often overlooks or dismisses as irrelevant. This intuitive accuracy wasn't limited to social contexts. Kahneman's research showed that women often outperformed men in complex decision-making scenarios where multiple variables had to be balanced and where the optimal solution wasn't immediately obvious. Their ability to integrate diverse types of information, logical, emotional, social, temporal, often led to more creative and effective solutions. Have you ever witnessed a woman make a decision that seemed illogical at the time but turned out to be remarkably prescient? The research also revealed fascinating differences in how men and women processed failure and success. Kahneman found that women showed greater resilience to failure in terms of learning and adaptation, while men showed greater resilience in terms of confidence maintenance. Women were more likely to extract lessons from failure and modify their approaches, while men were more likely to maintain their confidence and persist with their original strategies. These are not weaknesses or strengths in absolute terms, Kahneman had noted, but different adaptive strategies that have served human societies well in different contexts. The female approach optimizes for learning and improvement. The male approach optimizes for persistence and confidence. Both are crucial for human success. Dr. Chen realized that this research could revolutionize how we thought about education, leadership, innovation, and human potential. But she also understood Kahneman's hesitation to publish it. In a world where gender differences were often used to justify inequality, this research required sophisticated interpretation and careful presentation to avoid misuse. The most profound section of Kahneman's hidden research dealt with what he called relational cognition, the finding that women's cognitive processes were fundamentally oriented toward understanding and maintaining relationships and social systems. This wasn't about being more social or emotional, but about having cognitive architectures that naturally prioritized relational and systemic thinking. The female mind appears to be designed for what we might call social engineering, in the most positive sense, Kahneman had written. The ability to understand, predict, and optimize complex social systems. This may be one of the most important cognitive capabilities for navigating an increasingly interconnected world. This relational orientation showed up in how women approached problem-solving, leadership, negotiation, and even scientific research. Women were more likely to consider the impact of their decisions on relationships and social systems, more likely to seek collaborative solutions, and more likely to prioritize long-term social sustainability over short-term individual gains. But Kahneman's research also revealed the shadow side of these cognitive gifts. The same mental processes that made women excel at relational and systemic thinking also made them more vulnerable to certain types of cognitive overload and emotional exhaustion. The constant processing of social and emotional information could become overwhelming in environments that didn't acknowledge or support these cognitive needs. We have created a world that demands the unique cognitive gifts of the female mind while failing to provide the conditions necessary for those gifts to flourish, Kahneman had observed. It's like asking a supercomputer to run advanced programs while providing only basic electrical power. Dr. Chen found this observation particularly poignant as she reflected on her own career and the careers of her female colleagues. How many brilliant women had been lost to exhaustion, overwhelm, or the sense that they somehow didn't fit in academic or professional environments that had been designed around different cognitive models. The final section of Kahneman's research dealt with what he called generative cognition, the ability to create new ideas, solutions, and possibilities through the integration of diverse perspectives and information sources. His studies showed that women often excelled at this type of thinking, particularly in collaborative environments where they could build on and enhance the ideas of others. Innovation may not be primarily about individual genius, Kahneman had written, but about the ability to synthesize diverse inputs into novel combinations. The female mind's natural orientation toward integration and collaboration may be ideally suited for the kinds of complex problem-solving our world increasingly demands. This finding challenged traditional models of creativity and innovation that emphasized individual brilliance and competitive advantage. Kahneman's research suggested that the most innovative solutions often emerged from the kind of collaborative, integrative thinking at which women naturally excelled. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Kahneman's hidden research was his conclusion that the cognitive differences between men and women were not fixed limitations, but complementary strengths that were optimized when combined. His studies of mixed-gender teams showed that groups that effectively leveraged both male and female cognitive strengths consistently outperformed homogeneous groups on complex tasks. The future of human problem-solving, Kahneman had written, in his final notes, lies not in choosing between different cognitive approaches, but in learning to orchestrate them effectively. The male mind and the female mind are like different instruments in an orchestra, each beautiful on its own, but capable of creating something transcendent when played together. Dr. Chen realized that this was why Kahneman had kept this research hidden for so long. It wasn't just about understanding women's minds, it was about revolutionizing how we thought about human cognition itself. Publishing this research would have required a complete reframing of psychology, neuroscience education, and organizational behavior. What do you think would happen if our educational systems and workplaces were redesigned to leverage the unique cognitive strengths that Kahneman identified in women? After months of deliberation, Dr. Chen made the decision to begin publishing Kahneman's hidden research. She started with academic papers that carefully contextualized the findings and emphasized their implications for optimizing human potential rather than limiting it. The response from the scientific community was immediate and intense. Some researchers celebrated the findings as validation of what they had long suspected about gender differences in cognition. Others criticized the research as potentially reinforcing harmful stereotypes, but the data was too robust and the methodology too rigorous to dismiss easily. Dr. Chen found herself at the center of a global conversation about gender, cognition, and human potential. She worked tirelessly to ensure that Kahneman's research was presented in ways that celebrated the unique gifts of both men and women while avoiding the trap of using differences to justify inequality. The practical implications of the research began to emerge as educators, business leaders, and policymakers started applying Kahneman's insights. Schools that redesigned their pedagogical approaches to include more collaborative learning saw improvements in female students' performance and engagement. Companies that restructured their teams to leverage complementary cognitive strengths reported better innovation outcomes and higher satisfaction scores, but perhaps the most profound impact was on women themselves. As the research findings became more widely known, many women reported feeling validated and understood in ways they had never experienced before. The idea that their complex, integrative thinking style wasn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be leveraged, was transformative for countless individuals. For the first time in my life, I understand why I think the way I do, one woman wrote to Dr. Chen. I always felt like there was something wrong with me because I couldn't just focus on one thing at a time. Now I realize that my mind is designed to see connections and patterns that others might miss. It's not a bug, it's a feature. This response was echoed by thousands of women who suddenly had a scientific framework for understanding their own cognitive experiences. The research provided not just validation, but also practical strategies for optimizing their mental performance and advocating for environments that supported their natural cognitive strengths. The research also had unexpected implications for men. As the findings became more widely discussed, many men reported feeling relieved to understand why they sometimes struggled in collaborative or emotionally complex situations. The research suggested that their more linear, focused thinking style was not inferior, but simply different, optimized for different types of challenges and contexts. Dr. Chen began developing training programs and workshops based on Kahneman's research, teaching individuals and organizations how to recognize and leverage different cognitive strengths. The goal was not to pigeonhole people based on gender, but to help everyone understand and optimize their unique mental capabilities while learning to work effectively with others who thought differently. 1 year after beginning to publish Kahneman's hidden research, Dr. Chen reflected on the journey and its impact. The findings had sparked conversations, challenged assumptions, and begun to change how people thought about gender and cognition. But more importantly, they had started to create space for all individuals to understand and celebrate their unique cognitive gifts. Daniel Kahneman spent his career trying to understand how the human mind really works, Dr. Chen wrote in her concluding paper. His hidden research on women's cognition represents perhaps his most profound contribution, not because it revealed women to be superior or inferior to men, but because it revealed the beautiful complexity and sophistication of human consciousness in all its forms. The legacy of Kahneman's hidden research continues to unfold as researchers, educators, and individuals apply its insights to create more inclusive, effective, and human-centered approaches to learning, working, and living. The research reminds us that understanding differences is not about creating divisions, but about appreciating the full spectrum of human cognitive capability. If this exploration of women's unique cognitive gifts has resonated with you, if you've recognized patterns in your own thinking or in the women in your life, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences and observations could provide valuable insights for others who are trying to understand and optimize their own cognitive strengths. And please, if this content has opened your eyes to new ways of thinking about gender and cognition, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. By sharing these important discoveries, we can continue building a world that recognizes, celebrates, and leverages the full spectrum of human mental capability. Daniel Kahneman's hidden research wasn't just about understanding how women's minds work. It was about recognizing that human cognition is far more diverse, sophisticated, and beautiful than we ever imagined. The future belongs not to one type of thinking, but to the harmonious integration of all the different ways human consciousness can perceive, process, and create meaning from the complexity of existence. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to prove that women think better or differently than men, but to create a world where every person can think in the way they're naturally designed to think and contribute their unique cognitive gifts to our collective human endeavor.